panelists. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Dick. He's also seeing his picture here. But I'm going to pass the mic over to Dick so that he can reply. And maybe, sure, is that right? Sure, pass my
And I didn't know, I didn't know I was mentioned in Mike Harrington's autobiography by name. I'm mentioned in several places, more often about Port Huron and the police car. So I'd like to reverse that. But anyway, I really appreciate the comments of all the panelists. They were very thoughtful and very generous. And I really don't have anything specific to say in terms of Leo's comments, because we're so in agreement. I think Chris and Sam, in part, were criticizing me for over-optimism. I think in the case of Chris, for talking about the Mexican explosion as if it were about to happen, and the Tri-National Coalition, which by the way does exist, but it probably exists more at the level of high-level union diplomacy rather than real commitment to transformation and struggle. I think I don't think a new kind of solidarity. I don't think these discussion. I agree completely with Sam's remark about international unionism or continental unionism could take the form, maybe even worse than tokenism, just business, the spread of business unionism and a continuing competitive approach for jobs and so on. That wouldn't take us anywhere. And I think a precondition, as we try to make clear, for the kind of new labor movement and new solidarity is an internal transformation of unions, an internal transformation of working class organizations. And I appreciated Catherine's remarks, which were very interesting, about the possible role of unions in seeding a new kind of labor movement and seeding a resurgence in Mexico of genuine labor movement. I'm not really optimistic, and I don't know if, I would like to be, and I try to be, and maybe we were straining for that when we grabbed onto the coalition between the United Electric Workers and FAT, the Mexican Small Union Federation, and the steel workers and the mineros. But I think, all we're really saying about them is they are possible seeds of a new class struggle, continental unionism. But there are seeds that will die if there isn't a transformation of workers' culture and unions at the local, regional, national levels. I mean, and I fear that awareness is not really there yet. I attended this conference the last few days on the United Association of Labor Educators, and there were several top figures from the AFL-CIO there. I think the vice president.
I missed that session.
Okay, I think the vice president and the director of Immigration Matters.
And the head of International Affairs Department.
I didn't hear her speak, though. I heard two. And what really impressed me was with some of the discussions was the entrapment of their thinking within such narrow and old bounds, irrelevant bounds. They're still talking as if it's just a matter of being more tactically effective. If it's a matter of winning on this piece of legislation rather than that piece of legislation, not really understanding that a whole radically new approach has to be taken. So where the energy for a transformed labor movement will come from, I think, is not from the top leaders, though there may be some that, play an important role, but I think from ferment from below. And where I see some of that ferment in the U.S. is from the immigrant rights movement. Now, the immigrant rights movement in 2006 was incredibly impressive, and a lot of us and there is a struggle for the leadership in the immigrant rights community between working class rank and file leaders, union activists, and small business, and also the Catholic Church, which would like to capture that movement and push it in a more conservative direction. But I think there is a lot of energy and ferment there, and I think as we try to explore a little bit in chapter 8 of the book, I think things in Mexico may energize that movement if things explode there. Now, I think Mexico is thoroughly unpredictable now in terms of whether things are implode, explode. But we're at a moment right now, we're at a nadir, a low moment of working class resistance in Mexico. But at the same time, there is a tremendous tradition and history of combativity among workers that still lives, the tradition. And the conditions of the living conditions, the oppression, the suffering, on every indicator, things are getting much, much worse all the time for Mexican workers. And the combination of that with the crisis of the regime creates a tremendously explosive mix, which could lead to an intensified and maybe more crystallized military regime, covered by the idea of civilian government. So I'm not optimistic, but without the transformation of the labor movement, and I put unions in the core, then I think there's no hope for North America, for things not getting much worse for most people in North America, because unions have inherent limits by their very nature, limits that have been debated among Marxists for a long time. Lenin, Trotsky talk about that. The value of limits of unions and union struggles beyond defensive of the working class is if they contribute to the raising of class consciousness, the cultivation of a culture of solidarity among the working class. That requires a certain kind of unionism. And unions need a political and cultural transformation. They need to be part of a broader labor movement that becomes idealistic and moves beyond sectional interests to fighting for universal things. Like a point Sam often makes in his writings and talks, in the U.S., the movement towards private health plans, one through militant union struggle, left out a lot of the working class and creating a division instead of fighting together for a universal healthcare system. I think there are inherent dilemmas in unionism, and whether these dilemmas contribute to a more conservative or more radicalizing role depends. It's contingent on it, not just on the politics of the leaders, but on the circumstances of the moment. And the best discussion of that I've ever seen is an old pamphlet, I think 1971 or something like that, that Richard Hyman wrote, and that a few of you know because I used it every year in my teaching. And it's a wonderful pamphlet called Marxism and the Sociology of Trade Unionism. And in that pamphlet, Hyman talks about how in different circumstances, unionism, even economistic unionism, can be a radicalizing force. In other circumstances, it can be a conservatizing. It depends. And Ernie's point that unions per se are not revolutionary organizations, and Sam's about the weakness of the left, brings me to the point that I forgot earlier in my
I'm
comment.
not as dogmatic as that. I have a more flexible.
Is that without the development of a left, there's not much chance of a transformation of unions. Ferment among the rank and file, which may happen and does happen independent of the left, has its own limitations if it's not informed by a more broad approach of class struggle. That broad approach has to come from a radical left. And the terrible moment we're in Canada and the US, and in some ways in Mexico, less so, is the absence of a revolutionary left. Not only the absence of a revolutionary left embedded in the working class movement, but a revolutionary left embedded anywhere, except academia, except York. And that's what we have to create. And these are all coincident or simultaneous steps, trying to relate to Fermat. And I think the Greater Toronto's Workers' Assembly, which I haven't been involved in for about a year because I've been finishing the book, was in part an attempt to try to bridge the different struggles and bridge the different movements, the anti-poverty movement, the left and the labor movement, and it stumbles along, but I think it points in the direction of new organizational forms, as also new organizational forms that were hinted at, alluded to by Catherine, that need to be created. We need a transformation of the left and of the union movement.
I guess I'm lucky enough to have the last word here, and I just want to say that one of the wonderful things about this book is that it gives 3 different contexts and historical contexts from which we can start asking and developing our questions going forward and thinking about our strategies. And I think that that's one of the most wonderful things, that as we learn from one another, then that becomes the basis from which solidarity can be built in an authentic way. And I think that really is the experience, much of the experience in North America, where we have been able to develop relationships among workers across borders. That has really been crucial, relationships based on some kind of mutual understanding. And I think that this is one of the gifts of this book, and I really thank Edward and Dick for their work into it, that we were able to celebrate it tonight and that we can go forward.